I'd like to tell you a little bit about Christian before he begins. Christian Coon has not lived in Iowa for 25 years, but this is his home and he is one of us. In fact, Christian grew up in a clergy family. His father, Denny Coon, is a retired pastor in the Iowa Annual Conference and is one proud father. Christian has a BA from Simpson College, Master of Science degree in journalism from the Meadow School of Journalism at Northwestern University, and an MDiv from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. Christian served 2 United Methodist churches in the Chicago suburbs before starting Urban Village, a new church start that now has 4 different locations in the Chicago area. Christian is the lead pastor, and if you go on the Urban Village website, you'll find these words: bold, relevant, inclusive. And we are rooted in the gospel of Jesus Christ, which tears down walls and builds up life. Christian is the primary pastor at one of the sites, and each site is unique. They're different because the location, context, and needs vary from place to place. You may remember we talked a little bit this morning about adaptive ministry and the fact that we have to be continually adapting our ministry to where we are. Urban Village has been an amazing experiment in doing church differently, and lives are being changed on a daily basis. However, anyone who has started a new church from scratch knows that failure is inevitable. Not everything is going to go well. There will be fits and starts and moments of great joy as well as deep despair. Last year, Christian published a book through Discipleship Resources of the United Methodist Church. It's called Failing Boldly: How Falling Down in Ministry Can Be the Start of Rising Up. I've read Christian's book, and I know it will speak to you as well, as he shares how embracing the gift of failure can open many doors to spiritual growth, personal development, and future success. His book is available at the Cokesbury store here at Annual Conference, and he will also be leading one of the workshops this afternoon. I'm sure he would love to sign your book. Please welcome back to Iowa, difference maker Christian Coon.
Thank you, Bishop.
And I'm going to give this hat to him now. He doesn't have to wear it now, but this is our Iowa Annual Conference Difference Maker hat, because we know that you are a difference maker, and then this is also a gift for you. I'll just lay them here right now for you.
Sounds great. Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you.
Friends, thank you so much. It is truly a joy to be with you here at the Iowa Annual Conference. As the Bishop mentioned, I'm a native Iowan and have some experience here at the Iowa Annual Conference. Some of you may know me through my father over there at table 21, Denny Coon, retired pastor. So I do know a few of you, but I also know there are a lot of you who are here today probably asking yourselves the question, how is it that somebody from Chicago can come and speak to us, and how will this relate to what I am doing in my own context, whether it be in Grundy Center or Shenandoah or Guttenberg or whatever? So I have to give a little bit more of my Iowa credentials. I was born in Cedar Falls and have lived in Washington, Eldora, Manchester, and Indianola. If that doesn't satisfy you, I have another photo perhaps to show you too. So this is myself and my dad and my son Ethan. And if you can tell, probably we are standing next to the Butter Cow at the Iowa State Fair. We make an annual pilgrimage to the State Fair every August. If you look closely, what's most important is my son. He's 13. He's wearing a Hawkeye cap. For those of you who are not Hawkeye fans, if you look closely at his arm, he went to the Varied Industries building, and so you can find an Iowa State, a Drake, a UNI temporary tattoo on his arm. But most importantly, you can find a Simpson College tattoo on his arm, my alma mater. So I am doing my best to try to get both of my kids to come to college to Iowa. My daughter is going to be a senior next year. To be honest, I don't hold a lot of hope that that's going to happen for her, but both of them have the Iowa genes, to be sure, and I do my best to make sure that that is a part of how they're growing up. So even though my context is the city, I hope that what I share with you today can relate to you no matter where you live, whether you are in a city or a county seat or a farming community. So as the bishop noted, I am the co-founder of Urban Village Church, a United Methodist church in Chicago, in the city. And we have 4 locations throughout the city. A year ago, my book, Failing Boldly, How Falling Down in Ministry Can Be the Start of Rising Up, was published. And I was approached to write a book in 2014. I knew immediately the kind of book that I did not want to write. How many of you have been to some kind of church growth conference? I see quite a few hands that are up. I find those kinds of conferences, on the one hand, occasionally inspiring. I get some good ideas. It's great to hear what other people are doing around the country. But if I'm honest with you, I also find those conferences just a little bit deflating. I walk away from those conferences and I'll sit there and I'll watch the person speaking, and often the story goes something like this, that they went and either tried to revive a ministry or started a brand new church, and they talk about how they prayed so hard for this, and often there's a story of maxing out personal credit cards or something like that to keep the ministry going. And then, within months, they're worshiping 5,000 people. And so when I hear those stories, on the one hand, it's like, wow, that's amazing. What can I learn from this speaker? But then there's a voice that goes on in my head. And I think to myself, I'm working pretty hard myself. But if we increase worship like 10%, I'm feeling pretty good at myself. Why am I not doing what that main speaker is? How come my ministry is not flourishing and growing like crazy like that speaker's is? And then that voice begins to keep on talking to me. And the voice says, well, clearly you are not as gifted as the person who is speaking up front. If you were as good of a speaker, as a pastor, or whatever, as that person up there, then you would be worshiping 5,000 people. And at first I'll push back on that a little bit. Well, no, people say that I'm a pretty good preacher. They say nice sermon, pastor, when they walk out of the church and everything like that. Is that really true? But the voice keeps saying, well, really, you're probably just not that good, or you're not as good as the person who is up front. And then when that happens, that spiral of questions in my own head, that takes me and perhaps any of you, well, I should ask, has that ever happened to anyone else before? I want to know that I see at least one person. Thank you for that, for being honest. And so I start to have those doubts. So when I thought about writing a book about Urban Village, I knew that I didn't want to write a book where I said, if you do these things, then your church will flourish and it will be great. So I want to say today what Urban Village is not. Urban Village is not a megachurch. I know Adam Hamilton has been here before, and I've talked to Adam. He worships, of course, thousands and thousands of people in Kansas City. They do great work. We are not Church of the Resurrection. We have 4 locations. Our smallest site worships about 50 or so. Our largest one worships about 120. So my guess is that's probably pretty relatable to a lot of you. We are proud of what we have done. Median age of our worship attender is 28, so we're doing a good job of reaching millennials and young adults, but we also have struggles ourselves. I'd like to show you a video that gives you a little bit of a taste of who Urban Village is, and then also show you kind of what we are, but then also what we are not. And then this was made about 8 years ago, so not long after we had our first worship service. So let's take a look.
When you put out there that you're starting a church where everyone is welcome, absolutely accepted where they are, I think that news gets out.
Being part of that very inclusive and accepting environment is probably one of the best feelings ever.
This is not the place that we say, you need to be this way. God loves you and Jesus loves you as you are.
That's a really pretty compelling place to be in a community where you don't have to make those commitments at the outset, where you can just really come with your questions, with your sense of wonder.
I have 2 children and I am looking forward to a church experience that works for them.
I really feel blessed that I finally felt like I found a home.
We started last July with Trey and I and our families, so we were under 10 people, and we had this vision for what this church could become. And it was all on paper, and we got really excited about the kind of church that we wanted to build. Right now we have 2 or 3 small groups that are meeting on an ongoing basis. Bible studies, we have an LGBT group that is meeting regularly.
We do music from jazz to contemporary to old hymns to gospel to YouTube.
So far we have volunteered at places like the Greater Chicago Food Depository and the Night Ministry.
There are tons of ways of following Jesus. And that can be frustrating for some religious people who want to say, this is what following Jesus looks like. Well, maybe that's one way of what following Jesus looks like, but there are different ways to follow.
What we are trying to do is be a church for all people, no matter what denomination they may have come from, no matter what belief they may have, but we are doing it in a way that is distinctly United Methodist.
It is a space that challenges you a little and stretches you a little and shows you different people thinking and talking and worshiping God differently. And that's a good thing.
I've met people that I think hold really different beliefs than I do, and yet who've given me pause and like made me think, and that's really exciting. That feels challenging to me.
The sermons are relevant, and that's not something that I had necessarily had experience with in the past.
Jesus was one who welcomed all to the table.
You don't have to be anything besides who you are at this church.
It's a fun place to be.
Faith does actually make a difference in the way you live, in the way you experience the world, in the way you love and allow yourself to be loved.
It's probably not a coincidence that you're listening to this message right now, so come and see. What could it hurt?
I am grateful to have a brother-in-law who does video production for a living. And so he is the one who really put this video together. And when I first watched this, I thought, this is a really good video. This is the kind of video for like a really good church. And so when we put it out there, I still to this day, when I watch it, I get kind of goosebumps. But also, so that's whenever we watch or see things like this, or we see others who are doing so well, and often we don't hear the other side of things. So there were 7 people who spoke in this video. Any guesses as to how many people are still part of Urban Village Church? Any guesses? 1. Me. Trey Hall is the other co-founder. He moved away about 2.5 years ago to England. I'm still working on the forgiveness part of that, for him doing that. 2 of the other folks who spoke moved away, a pretty common thing in cities. 2 of them went on to new things. One went to a different church. One went to just kind of a new thing in her life. She's actually a neighbor of mine. And when we had coffee, and she said, you know, I have different parts of my life where I like to try new things. And so church was good for me about 2 years. I'm going to move on to this other thing. And one woman, as the millennials like to say these days, just ghosted on us. I reached out to her to find out what happened. You shared these great testimonies. You were in our video. This is something that we did. And then I didn't hear back from her. So I share all of this to say that church work is hard. And I hope that today, no matter what, if you get anything at all out of this talk, maybe the one thing that I want to say is that church work is really challenging for all of us. And there might be times when we get so frustrated by the kind of ministry that we are doing, and we don't see the fruits that we would like to see, and we go home at night and we wonder, and we say our prayers, we say, Lord, is it all worth it? Because I'm here kind of at the end of my rope. I just, as a supplement to the book, I also do a podcast called Failing Boldly, and recently I interviewed 2 individuals, Ray Jean Preshold Bell and Jason Biasi, who just wrote a book called Faithful and Fractured, Responding to the Clergy Health Crisis. And this is a quote from the book, and it says this: another implication of doing sacred work is that the stakes of perceived failure are higher for clergy than for other workers. The stakes of perceived failure are higher for clergy than for other workers. The converse may also be true. Perceived success may be more meaningful to clergy. It therefore seems likely that clergy will experience extremes of both positive and negative emotions when engaging in their vocation. So clergy, and I think lay leaders too, feel the highs more than anybody, but they also feel the lows more than anyone too. And so today I want to name that church work, faithful church work, is hard. But we are also in a time where we hear so much about decline and wondering about our future. But friends, we are in a time now more than ever where we are called to do all we can to, as the theme of this annual conference says, to create difference makers in new communities of faith. And when you create, you are going to fail. And that's okay. In fact, it's more than okay. There's a really great book that I read a few years ago by Charles Duhigg called The Power of Habit. He talks about what folks at NASA do and what they try to get their engineers, they try to push their engineers to try new things. And it gets to the point too, and again, this is a quote from the book, when unmanned rockets explode on takeoff, department heads would applaud so that everyone would know that their division had tried and failed, but at least they had tried. Eventually, mission control filled with applause every time something expensive blew up. So many different organizations and individuals know that when you risk, when you attempt new things, it might just blow up on you. And then, can we get to the point where perhaps we even applaud that? Because we know that we have learned something. And this will help us for the next time that we risk and try something new. So today I want to talk a little bit, before I get to failure though, I want to talk a little bit about improving and creating. There's a really wonderful series of papers that were written within the last 5 years by some folks at the Harvard Divinity School called How We Gather. I highly recommend it for you. You can just Google How We Gather in Harvard. I'm sure you'll find them. The series started out, the authors wanted to find out how are millennials gathering these days? How do they find meaning in their lives so that they could write something and the church could respond? And what they found too is that millennials are beginning to find communities and create communities that are doing the things that churches used to do, or at least that they sense that churches used to do, find meaning in community and individual communities. One of the papers I would particularly recommend is called Faithful. It was written in part by Gil Rendle. You may know Gil Rendle, used to work for the Alban Institute, has written many books about church health and church leadership. And one of the things that the authors and Gil Rendle point out is this, is that churches spend a lot of time improving things, but they don't spend enough time on creating things. So what do we mean by that? So this is from one of the papers called Faithful that the folks at Harvard came out with. And they said, this is what improving means. And improving means that we are learning to do things that we already know how to do. We are just doing them better or wanting to do them better. We are reaching people that we already probably know how to connect to, how we relate to, and we are doing them, generally speaking, within the structures of the organized church, or what we already know how to do. That's improving. Now, I don't want you to walk away today and say, well, that speaker said we shouldn't improve at all. That's not what I'm saying. And that's not what Gil Rendle and the other authors are saying too. Improving is good. We need to keep improving. But we, as the church, don't spend nearly enough time creating. And that's what I want to also touch on quickly here, what creating does. It means that we're learning new ways to do things that we don't know how to do. It serves those that we are not connected to, and sometimes it goes beyond the scope of established institutions. So we are trying new things that aren't put out by the denomination. We're experimenting, and we're seeing what else is out there. That's what it means to create. Let me talk a little bit about improving. So improving, again, is to look at what we have, our worship, our Christian education, whatever it is, our buildings, and we see what can we do to improve so that the people that we know in our community will come to us. They're probably people that we're already familiar with your town's culture or your church, and that's fine. But we spend nearly all of our time doing that. What I would like to do for you, just for the next 60 seconds, is turn to your neighbor. And when I say turn to your neighbor, I know I am usually more of an introvert, and I know the introverts in the room, when I say turn to your neighbor, are a little bit anxious about that because you're going to have to share a little bit, but it's only for 60 seconds, so it's okay. What I would like you to do is just turn to a neighbor and tell your neighbor what are a couple of things that you need to improve or that you want to improve on in your church. All right? Simple question. What are 2 or 3 things that you want to improve on in your church? 60 seconds. Go. All right, I'm going to bring you back now. I think that was about 60 seconds. So we talk about the things that we are already doing, and we want to make them better so that people will be attracted and come to us, usually on Sunday mornings. And again, that's great. So at Urban Village, people sometimes talk about the cutting edge ministry that we do. But to be honest, I think what we have done, generally speaking, is just we've improved things. That what we do isn't radically different. We do worship on Sunday mornings, we do small group, we do all kinds of different things, but we have just been improving. One of the things for us at the site, I'm at the South Loop site, so for those who aren't familiar with Chicago, if you've ever been to the Field Museum or the Shedd Aquarium, that's the part of the South Loop neighborhood of Chicago. One of the biggest things that we needed to improve was our hospitality or our coffee hour. One of the things that I miss most about Iowa are people baking things at home. We work with a lot of young adults, and God bless them, we love them. But on Sunday mornings after worship, usually, if they make coffee, that's great. And then also, they may just buy a package of Chips Ahoy and just kind of throw it out on the table and not even really put it on a plate or anything like that. And then I just say, oh, millennials. So I turned to a couple in our church, John and Liz. I said, John and Liz, we really need to up our hospitality game. Can you help us? Can you give us a model of what hospitality can look like? So they went crazy. So you can see here the homemade, this was, as you can tell, Halloween time, homemade cupcakes, all kinds of different goodies. If you continue to look, on the left side of the picture, there's a jack-o'-lantern. That's guacamole. That kind of looks like the jack-o'-lantern got sick. But the kids loved it. They couldn't wait to get their chips, and there's also, they had healthy things. There are carrots down there on the end. And since John and Liz have been giving us a model of how to improve hospitality, everybody else is upping their game. They're not doing this every week, but it's gotten a lot better. And I'm grateful for that. But when I talk about improving, we're still only really reaching the people who are coming to us on Sunday mornings, which means they are not totally opposed to worship. They're interested. They're exploring. They want to know what goes on in this space on Sunday mornings. We are not reaching the people who want absolutely nothing to do with church, who want absolutely nothing to do with worship. Creating means that we are doing our best to try to reach those folks. And now here's where I have to give some obligatory statistics about the rise of people who don't care about church. So this is from the 2012 Pew Research Center report called Nuns on the Rise. I think we've probably all heard about the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, those who check nun when asked to give what their religious preference is. And it says this, that nearly 1 in 3 nuns, and this is speaking of just millennials, but 1 in 3 have zero interest in being part of a faith community. And of that group, so 33% have no interest in being part of a faith community. Of that group, only 10% are even mildly interested in maybe something that could be down the road. So 90% of that group don't care about church. So from here on out, when I talk about the 90%, that's what I mean. Those folks who will never come to anything that we offer on Sunday mornings, even if we have jack-o'-lanterns vomiting guacamole. They will not be coming to us on Sunday mornings. So when I use 90%, I don't just mean the millennials. I mean anyone in our own communities who have zero interest in church at all. What are we doing to try to reach them because we believe in the transforming power of the gospel of Jesus Christ? Are we going to just say, well, they're never going to come to us on Sunday morning, so somebody else will do that? How can we reach the people who have no idea what "oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing" means, and who think that dipping bread in grape juice is kind of hashtag awkward? How are we going to reach out to them? And this is what we do when we talk about creating new spaces and new opportunities for these folks. So I'm going to do one more, turn to your neighbor. And what I'd like for you to do is first, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds of just thinking on your own time. I want you to think about your own communities and think, where do people hang out? Where do people spend their time? I'm sure for all of you, the first thing you would say, well, they hang out at our church, which is great. Other than your church, where do people in your towns, cities, where do they spend time and where do they hang out? So take about 30 seconds, think about that, then turn to a neighbor, take another 60 seconds, and share what are two of the top places where people hang out. All right. So for folks who are sitting near the front here, am I on? There I am. So that I can hear you, where are some places that people named other than your church? Where? McDonald's, all right. Soccer fields. Their room, okay. Coffee shop. The phones. I heard something trail. Bike trails. Walmart. These are all kinds of great places. Maybe schools, I would imagine stuff going on at schools. Tattoo parlors, maybe, truck stops. I was trying to think of, for when I grew up in Iowa, where were the places where people hung out? Farmers market, did I hear farmers market? All of these are the places where people are hanging out. What can we do to create new spaces and new opportunities for these folks? I mentioned earlier the paper that Gil Brendel was a part of called Faithful. And one of the interesting things that I read in this paper was something that the Florida Annual Conference is doing. One of the things that they're doing is they're giving out grants. They're giving out money for new missional communities. It's called New People, New Places, New Ways. And they are giving people some guidelines of what these missional communities are and specifically what they are not. So, for example, they must be highly relational and they must almost always meet outside of your church buildings. So all of the things that you talked about with your neighbors and that we just called out, these are the kinds of things that the Florida Annual Conference is funding, meeting in those kinds of places. But that's not just that. They also will not fund new contemporary worship services. They will not fund anything that has Bible studies. They will not fund anything that has food pantries. And then when I read this at first, I thought, well, then what? What are we going to do? And that's what they're trying to get people to think creatively about what is it that you can offer to these folks that may begin the slow process for them, especially in establishing a relationship with Jesus. Now, when we begin to do these things, sometimes they're called micro-communities. When we start to do these things, there are often two questions that will immediately pop up. So let's say you're going to start some sort of gathering group at McDonald's. You're going to have that time, and people at your church hear about this group that you're having. You're not doing a Bible study necessarily. You're just beginning to build relationships. You're listening to the people who are not coming to your church to hear what are the things on their hearts, what are the things that keep them up at night. And you're listening to them. So folks at the church may hear about this group that you're starting, and they may be excited about the McDonald's and this McDonald's ministry. And then the question that they will often ask is, this is wonderful, when are they going to start coming to worship? Or when can we get them on the trustees? We need a new staff parish committee person, young adult, a YA. When can we get them in the door for those? Friends, we need to fight those asking those questions. This is a long process. And this is a message to conferences, this happens more frequently than I would like. Conferences hear about a new faith community, and then they will ask the question pretty quickly, when are they going to start paying apportionments? We need to fight those, Bishop, I'm sorry, we need to fight those questions too, initially. I hear about new faith communities that are starting in other conferences, and they start having them putting apportionments on them, and that really hurts creative ministry at first. We are now beginning to pay apportionments, and it's a great way for us to begin to introduce United Methodism to them. Most people who come to Urban Village have no idea what a Methodist is. In fact, if you ask, probably most people would say, oh yeah, Urban Village is a non-denominational church. So we do our best to try to introduce them to who John Wesley is and all of these other things, but it takes time, and we need to fight asking those questions as we do these new things in our own communities. So on the one hand, all of this is kind of overwhelming, but on the other, it's kind of exciting. There was one quote from the paper that says, the field of soul care is a little like Silicon Valley in the 1980s, full of innovation and little money. There are all kinds of opportunities, creative ways that we begin to share the gospel in these places where people are already gathering. So what does innovation and creation begin to look at? I know one of the workshops after this is some folks, this is already happening in places in the Iowa Conference. You may have heard of the phrase fresh expressions that started in Europe and now is happening in the United States too. And there's a group that's going to be talking about fresh expressions in one of the workshops after my talk here today. So I'd encourage you, if you're just tired of me talking, go to the Fresh Expressions workshop to begin to hear about some of the things that they are doing. I began to see this in action. Some folks from Urban Village went to Germany 3 years ago for a mission trip. Often when you go and do a mission trip, you're building something, or you're caring for folks. This was really an evangelism mission trip for us. And so we went to a city in East Germany, former East German Republic, called Chemnitz, a town of about 3,000 people. And so we went there, and they had a big kiddie fair one day with the bounce house and face painting and human foosball, all of these different things. And then one night, too, they had a whiskey tasting. And so I could sense my United Methodist forefathers and foremothers who were concerned about that, but it's Germany, and so we just kind of let it slide. And so they had a whiskey tasting that night, and they had the person up there talking about different kinds of whiskey, and I kept waiting for the hook. I kept waiting for them to say, by the way, we do worship here at this ministry called Inspire. We do worship here at this time, or we have this Bible study, and it never came. And I asked them about it. Well, where's the hook? And they said, Chemnitz is 80% atheist. 80% atheists. Before we even get to that point, we need to build community with them. It takes time. One of my heroes in the ministry now in the United States, somebody I just talked to yesterday, Mitch Marcello, in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Population 30,000. First United Methodist Church of Williamsport has what they call the ACTS Network. They have 13 different groups throughout Williamsport doing all kinds of different little ministries. They have a gym group where they come together and they lift for like 30 minutes. They have banana and water, and then they do like 5 minutes of worship. They have a gardening group. They have a meal every Monday night at what's called the Pajama Factory, a literal former pajama factory, where they're feeding people in Williamsport. And at that point, they're not doing anything, any Bible study, no worship, nothing. Because they need to build relationships, because so many people have such anxiety about who church is and what church is going to expect of me. So they're experimenting with this. And he said we have about 400 people in our orbit among these 13 different communities. And laity here today, if you're kind of tuning me out on this, Rich Marcello is a layperson. And he is directing this ACTS network, these 13 different groups going out throughout the city, exchanging and meeting with people. They have a kayak group that's going to be starting up. They're doing all of these things because they know there are people who will never walk into our church doors. What can you do in your community to begin these kinds of micro communities? 5, 10, 15 people. Sometimes these things can be so vibrant and be opportunities for folks, again, to build a relationship with Jesus. And then there, yes, may also be opportunities for them to be interested in coming to your own Sunday morning worship, and who knows, maybe being a trustee too. So regardless, friends, of whether you are in a place where we want to risk, but we're still in the improvement stage, but we also want to start creating wherever you are in your own context, what I have to say today, if you're truly risking and trying new things, you will fail. You will fail. And if you don't like that word, you will stumble. You will skin your knee. You will try something and fall down on your face, whatever it is. If we're truly risking for the gospel, not everything we do is going to work. So then what do we do when that happens? Well, I want to talk to you today about a man who lived in 18th century England and who probably has had an impact on nearly everybody who's seated here today. And I am not talking about John Wesley. Instead, I'm talking about a man named Edward Jenner. Edward Jenner was a scientist and surgeon in Great Britain in the late 18th, early 19th century. And at the time in England, cowpox was an issue for folks who lived there. It was a harmless disease contracted when people came in contact with, as you might imagine, cows. But one of the things that Edward Jenner discovered was that one of our local milkmaid told him, you know, it's interesting. When people get cowpox, they don't get smallpox, a much more deadly disease. And this started him thinking. And so he tried a little experiment. Now today we would frown on this, but there was one of the people that worked for him, a woman named Sarah, who had smallpox. And what he did was he found a little boy named James, 8-year-old James. Poor little 8-year-old James was the son of a gardener who worked for Dr. Jenner. And he scratched James's arm and went to Sarah, who had the cowpox, and put some of the smallpox or the cowpox into James's arm so that he would get cowpox. And he, sure enough, that's what he did. But after he recovered, then Edward Jenner did something else. He did what we call now variolation. He then put the smallpox into little James to see what would happen. Now today, of course, we couldn't believe that this happened, but this is what he did. And little James, you probably can guess, did not get smallpox. Edward Jenner is really the father, the inventor of the vaccination. So why am I talking about Edward Jenner? As I was thinking about failure, as I was writing about this for my book, I thought what we need to do is inoculate our systems with a little bit of failure initially so that we prevent larger failure in the future. To risk and try some things to stub our toes now, because if we don't, then something more serious might happen in the future with the ministries that we love so dearly. So what can we do to inoculate our systems with small little failures. Well, one of the things you may be familiar with SMART goals in your churches, or you may be familiar with what are called BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals. I saw on the conference website that you have a wildly important goal now, that every church will have a discipleship system by the year 2020. These are all wonderful, great goals to have. I wonder, as we talk about these goals, if we, if not set a failure goal per se, at least name in these goals, when we set these goals and try these new things, not everything is going to go well. To name that up front so that we can begin the process of destigmatizing failure. So that we know it's not the end of the world when all of the things that we try don't go well. I mentioned this with the NASA example earlier, but one of my favorite passages in the Bible, so I have a whole chapter in my book about failure in the Bible, characters who did not always do what they were supposed to do, but this is actually the story of the parable of the sower. You know this one from Matthew 13. Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil, finally, and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. There are lots of ways that we have interpreted this scripture, lots of really wonderful ways of interpreting this scripture, but when I was thinking about failure and I read this passage, I thought, this person is not a very good farmer. Did you notice what he does when he goes out and sowing the seed? He first starts throwing it on the path. And then I love to use my imagination and looking at scripture and trying to get a sense of what might have been happening in this individual's life. So I can imagine him going home that night to his wife and said, honey, I sowed some seeds on the path today and nothing happened. And she might say, well, honey, go try it again tomorrow. So he says, all right. And so he goes out the next day and starts throwing some seeds some more. And this time, let's try the rocky soil. And still, nothing is happening. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm a sower and I go out twice and it's not happening for me, I'm beginning to think maybe I shouldn't be sowing seeds anymore. But sure enough, he keeps at it a third time. How about the thorns? I'm going to start sowing seeds in the thorns and see what happens. And still, nothing is happening. And he goes home, honey, maybe I should give it up. And perhaps she says, well, maybe try one more time. So he goes back out, finally finds the good soil. What I love about this story is that at first he's throwing the seeds and nothing's happening, and so often in our context we think, well, that didn't work, let's just go back to the way we're doing things. He says, let's try something else. Everyone says nothing is going to happen in the rocky soil. Let's see if that's true. Let's try it in the thorns. Everyone says thorns aren't going to work. Let's give it a shot. And finally he finds the good soil too. I love that he keeps on sowing seeds no matter what. You might be told in your own towns, farming communities, cities, well, don't go there. People aren't going to want to hear about Jesus in that context. And so we might think to ourselves, well, they're right. Let's just approve what we already do. I say go out and start throwing some seeds in places where people say nothing is going to happen in those places. Because the gospel of Jesus Christ is too important for us not to do that. And if it doesn't happen at first, try a second time, a third time, a fourth time. There is good soil out there. We need to destigmatize failure so that we don't think, well, it didn't work that time. I don't want to be embarrassed anymore, so I'm just going to go back, tail between my legs, and not try anymore. This is a wonderful passage for us, I think, folks, to really reflect on and pray over. And also, can we even get to the point where we celebrate failure and even laugh about it? One of my favorite examples of this happens because of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. I'm a big ice cream fan. Right now, American Dream is one of my favorites. A few years ago, we went out to Vermont to visit some family, and we had to make the pilgrimage to Ben & Jerry's. So as we were there touring the factory, we went back to our car, and I noticed that there was a little graveyard, and I got closer to the tombstones, and what they have done is to create a flavor graveyard. And you can find this online too. If you Google Flavor Graveyard, Ben & Jerry's, you will see what they are doing. So this is a quote from their website. It says, Ben & Jerry's is known for outrageous, chunky, funky flavors. But outrageous flavor experimentation comes with some risks. And flavors can meet their untimely end even without using a spoon. But hear this, that's okay with us because ice cream flavors, like everything else, have a beginning and an end. They have had 35 flavors, have their own little tombstone, including one called Coconutterly Fair, which I will say I'm glad that came to an end, as one who's not a fan of coconut. But they treat these failures with a little bit of levity, because they know in order to try new things, not everything is going to work. I hope and pray that one day, and Bishop, maybe this will happen here at the Iowa Annual Conference, that as we gather at all annual conferences, we do this in Northern Illinois, we have all kinds of wonderful stories of people doing amazing things for the gospel. We'll see great videos, people will come up, give their testimonies. We need to keep doing that. What I want and hope that at least one annual conference one year says, friends, we're going to bring up First United Methodist Church, who tried a brand new thing and it did not work. They bring them up and they can talk about that. And then others can say, oh, not everything that I do is going to work. And that's okay. And even that a conference can celebrate that someone took the risk to try to reach people for Jesus. And even though not every time it's going to happen in the way that we want, even if it doesn't bear the fruit right away, we need to keep doing that. So one of my favorite failure stories from Urban Village ties into if things don't work out the way we want, if we can then take also a second look, because something that God might be working in other ways in this seeming failure, and we didn't even realize it. So every year at Urban Village, we walk in the Pride Parade in Chicago. It's always the last weekend in June. And when we do in Chicago, there are literally hundreds of thousands, 2 million people to be around there, line the streets of the Pride Parade. And the first year we walked in it was the summer of 2010. I was overwhelmed at the number of people who were along the streets. And we were handing out flyers saying, God loves you. And as we were doing that, I walked away and thought, we have got to print more flyers. So the next year, we printed up thousands of flyers to hand along the route. And also, I told folks, I said, friends, the Sunday after the Pride Parade, we need to print more bulletins. We need to put out more chairs. We need to train our greeters, because we are going to have a flood of people coming through our doors for worship. And I could not wait. Sure enough, we printed more flyers. We're handing them out, all the same thing. And that next Sunday, I waited by the door saying, I can't wait for the hundreds of new people who are coming because they saw the flyers that we gave to them. And there was zero change in our worship. And I thought, why did we print all of those flyers? Why did we go through the effort of doing all of these things if it bore no fruit? So we did it again next year, and I thought, all right, forget printing the extra bulletins. Don't set out any extra chairs because nobody's going to come. But what I discovered was something really interesting. We have now done this for 8 years. And I can count on one hand the number of people who have come to worship because of a flyer we handed out at the parade. We are reaching that 90%, people who have zero interest in church. But what I've discovered is that this has become an amazing evangelism training ground for our people. We walk in the parade, and when we're done, people from Urban Village come up to me and say, that was awesome. They are walking along the streets telling people, God loves you. And they can't believe at first that they were a little hesitant about doing that, but once they got experience and saw the smiles that they got, they said, when can we do this again? And then they realize, when I tell a stranger that God loves them, all of a sudden, inviting my friend to worship doesn't seem so bad and doesn't seem so intimidating. So at first, this experiment, which seemed to be a failure, actually turned out to be a wonderful training ground, and I wasn't even aware of it. So when we try these new things, something else might be happening, and you don't even realize it. When you're sowing those seeds, you think, well, nothing is happening in the thorny ground. Let's go back. And someone might say, wait a minute, take another look. Maybe something is there, and we didn't even realize it. So last thing I want to talk about when we talk about creating and improving and trying new things is one of the big dangers of failure and experimenting and creating. And this happens when we compare ourselves to somebody else. I don't know about you. When we started at Urban Village, there was another church in Chicago that was starting called Soul City. And Soul City had still does, all the bells and whistles. They had the great website, everything else. And Trey and I, at first, we were like, we hate Soul City. Because we were beginning to compare ourselves to what they were doing. I would imagine this never happens in the Iowa Interconference. In Northern Illinois, though, sometimes we try new things, and we may see another church in our community who just seems to do things better than we do. Or maybe it's another United Methodist church in the town over. And we say, God loves you, that's great that you're doing. But inside, if we're honest with ourselves, we're a little bit, because we compare ourselves to what they are doing. And when we do that, friends, that doesn't help things much at all. One of the biggest things for me, a comparison story that I often tell, is when I have compared myself to Trey, who's the other co-founder of Urban Village. So this is a picture of Trey and I. The general stereotype of Trey and myself were that Trey is very extroverted, very charismatic. He literally is maxed out on his Facebook friends. He has 5,000 Facebook, he can get no more. I don't know where he meets these people, but there he is. And so people will say, well, Trey's the extrovert. He's the charismatic one. And then they look at me. And they'll say, oh, he has some gifts too. Well, that's not completely true. But they say he's the more introverted. He's the more thoughtful one. He's the more thoughtful one, a little more introverted. And you need both. You need both. And so at times when I need to really go out there and be an extrovert, I always kind of say to myself, I need to call on my inner Trey. And so here in this picture too, I'm kind of calling on my inner Trey here, trying to be a little bit more like him. But the problem, what that happens is that can really take you to some really tough places. We were at a time in our church where the site where I was worshiping, we moved locations. So we moved about 2 miles away. We rent our space in all of our worship locations. We don't have a building at all. And so we moved locations. And I thought, this will be great. This will be a new way for us to reach a new neighborhood, everything like that. And then, instead, our worship numbers just tanked. And we were worshiping a certain number, and then it went down and kept going down and kept going down, and I just kept trying harder, all of these things. Meanwhile, as that was happening, Trey was at our Wicker Park location, and Wicker Park could do no wrong. They were exploding with growth. They added a second service. And so I must confess to you, friends, that at times we'd be at our weekly staff meetings, and sometimes we'd report in, how did Sunday go? And Trey would say, yeah, it was great. And there'd be occasions where I would just hope and pray, God, please just say, Trey, we had a down Sunday, so that I would feel better about myself. Because my own numbers were not going like this. They were going like this. And then that caused me to reevaluate. In fact, there was literally a breakfast one day when I told Trey, I don't think I can do this much longer. I think it's time maybe for me to leave, because I just assumed he's the gifted one, and you can take it into your own hands. And he wisely just said, well, let's just pray about this first before you do that. And I'm grateful for spiritual direction. I'm grateful for retreat. I'm grateful for supportive friends, for all of those things. I'm grateful for them to help me realize, you know what? More than anything else, you need to remember you are a beloved child of God, that you are not measured by your worship attendance numbers, that you are not worshiped by how well you do, but instead, first and foremost, you are a beloved child of God, and that allows you to take these risks, and yes, to fail, and not do as well as you would like. And so, friends, I would say to you today, as one who has been there, do all you can to not compare yourself to how somebody else is doing. Look at your own context. And pray, Lord, where is the soil in my community where I can begin to sow my seeds, even though not everything will grow? This past week in the news, we've heard sadly and tragically about suicide, a couple of different instances. At Urban Village, we are not immune to this. Last February, one of our beloved members, a young woman who went to my side, died by suicide. It just harmed our community to no end. And we're still dealing with that. This past week at the Northern Illinois Annual Conference, we had a memorial service. And one of the things they did at the memorial service was they had bottles on every table and little pieces of paper. And they wanted us to write messages. Said, what the loved ones that you are thinking of now, those who have passed before us, what's a message, this cloud of witnesses in your own life, what is a message that you would want them to send to you? And I thought about Lex, and I have saved the text messages that we have exchanged back and forth. Lex suffered from, or lived with depression for a time, and I looked at some of the texts that she and I exchanged, and I came across one, and I texted her, I said, how are you doing? Do you need anything? I'm going to pay you a visit. Do you need anything? And she texted back to me, said, just yourself is more than enough. And that is a message that I think all of us can hold close to ourselves. Friends, thinking about risking and creating and improving, doing all of these things can cause some anxiety perhaps within us because we're not quite sure how things will work out and we don't know if we have it in us. But friends, the power of Jesus Christ, the power of the Holy Spirit, this creation that God has given to us, the combination of that and the fact that just yourself is more than enough to do amazing things in your own communities, to do amazing things for the Iowa Annual Conference. And when we do these things, not everything will turn out the way that we hope, but we know, friends, we know that when we do, lives will eventually be changed. Someone out there who wants nothing to do with the gospel will hear this new thing that you're doing. That one life will be transformed because the power of Christ and yourself is more than enough. Let us take hold of that message. Let us go out and create and try new things and live on the edge and even fail from time to time because that one life is more than worth it. Friends, thank you for your time and patience. Thank you for being here today. You'll be in my prayers. God bless you.